Thank you. Thank you, Alicia. Thanks to Bob and Irene and to all of you for being here. You guys are amazing, okay? The work you're doing, I mean, you're organized, you're pragmatic, you're effective. I'm so taken away by how great all this is. So thank you all for organizing this. So first and foremost, I want to make sure that you all at least leave here today understanding how optimistic you should be about what's happening right now. I feel like a lot of times, and I've been working at NIAC for 5 years, a lot of times working on these issues, there's a lot of doom and gloom. Working on any of the issues right now in Washington, there's not a lot of good news to report. And I mean, we were just talking earlier, I don't know what anybody in Washington is even there to do right now. There's no central narrative, there's no positive affirmative action that anybody is lining up behind. There's a lot of pessimism, there's a lot of question marks. What is the thing that we are trying to achieve? And I'm coming to you today to tell you a deal with Iran, an affirmative act for peace, not just preventing war, not just taking the possibility of another nuclear weapons state off the table, but actually beginning a process towards peaceful relations with a country with whom we have been at the brink of war with for the better part of the last decade, if not the past 3 decades. This is amazing. November 24th could mark a historic shift. This is the hinge of history turning right now, where you have the United States and Iran who haven't even talked to each other in 35 years. We now meet regularly with the Iranians. Right now, Secretary Kerry is in Oman, sitting down with his colleagues on the Iranian side of the table to engage in dialogue and to forge peace. 2 years ago, if you would have told me that this was happening, well, if you would have told me, I would have said, of course. But if you would have told a lot of people, they would have laughed you out of the room. They would have said that's impossible. And yet here we are today, just 2 weeks away from forging a new future headed towards peace with Iran. And the only reason that we're doing this, the only reason we're here is because of all of you. All right, now, so let me tell you who I am. I live in Washington, I work in Washington, I've been in DC for 8 years. I came to DC from Seattle. I came to DC and I worked on the Hill. I worked for a member of Congress. I was lucky enough to get hired by a member of Congress who is active on foreign policy, which is my passion, and active in Middle East issues. He's someone who, he actually was the first US official, he and Keith Ellison, and the Congressman's Carson Bryan Baird, he's now retired. He and Keith Ellison in 2009, they were the first US officials to go into Gaza after Operation Cast Lead. And they actually, instead of just going on the trips sanctioned by the groups who decide what you're allowed to vote for and what you're not allowed to vote for, they went on their own to Gaza to see that for themselves what happened. And they came back inspired. They came back inspired to not allow for this cycle of violence to continue. And Congressman Baird, he worked his butt off after that trip. I mean, before that he was working too, but there was a report, there was a Goldstone report. This is not an issue NIAC works on, but I was working under Brian Baird at the time, and he worked around the clock to try to prevent a congressional vote to disown that report and to denounce that report. Congress wanted to pretend like none of it ever happened, and he was working around the clock, making phone calls. I think he took off his entire weekend before the vote to try to convince his colleagues. He made 100 phone calls to his colleagues to convince them, don't vote for this resolution denouncing this report. I was there, I saw what happened. And after all this work that Congressman Baird put behind this effort, the vote still went forward. We organized all the efforts we could. The vote still went forward, and he got a whopping 34 people to vote against this thing. 34 out of 435 members of Congress voted against it, which is demoralizing. You spend all this time, you're so invested in this, and you see that only 33 of your colleagues are willing to do this. But I say that because then, later that year, when I told Congressman Baird that I was going to be moving on, I had taken a job with National Iranian American Council. I wanted to work on forging a diplomatic agreement between the US and Iran and to create a better future where Iranians and Americans could have relations and not be on the brink of war, he said, well, good luck. What I'm doing is easy compared to that. Nobody thought that was in the cards. Iran was public enemy number one on Capitol Hill. And yet now here we are, 2 weeks away from a possible agreement on the nuclear issue. And while we put into perspective how big of a deal this deal is, we also need to recognize this is not just about nukes. This isn't just about nuclear weapons. This is about much more than that. Not that ensuring Iran never acquires nuclear weapons, reducing the number of nuclear weapon states in the world is not a very, very big deal. But I think that sometimes when we talk about this, people say, well, what about all the other problems? What about, the human rights situation in Iran? Or what about the situation in Iraq and in Syria and Afghanistan and all these problems? This is just one tiny deal to deal with this nuclear issue. But you have to understand, this is about so much more. This is the beginning of a process. This is the beginning of untying this knot that has plagued U.S. relations in the region and has really been a big part of all these problems that we're seeing today. This is the first step towards beginning to unwind those problems. And we need to keep that in mind. And we can go into sort of what this all means. And I think probably a lot of you are aware of the recent history in Iran, where a new Iranian president was elected on the promise of building relations with the outside world and ending the standoff. But it's so much more than that. It's about the future of Iran. It's about the future of United States relations with Iran and what can happen in the region. So we got to get this deal. Because if we don't get this deal, we're looking at a much, much bleaker situation. If we don't get a nuclear deal, I think we can predict very quickly what happens. First, Congress passes new sanctions. Then Iran decides to enrich up to 20, 60, maybe even 90% weapons grade. Or Iran installs advanced centrifuges. Or Iran kicks out IAEA inspectors. Very quickly, this cycle of escalation grows to a place where it can't be contained. And you finally see these options on the table, these military options, become the only options on the table. If we don't get a deal, we are headed towards a fiasco. There's a lot hinged on these next 2 weeks. That being said, I'm optimistic we're going to get the deal, and I think for all of you, what you need to realize is that it's not just what happens in the next 2 weeks, it's, as Reverend Moore alluded to, it's what happens after those 2 weeks. Because once we get the deal, that doesn't mean we seal the deal. The way that this is structured right now is that the president has the power he can ink this deal. It's not going to be a treaty. It's not going to go to the Senate. It'll be an agreement solely between the president, the P5+1, and Iran. But as part of the deal, the United States needs to trade in sanctions in order for the Iranian nuclear concessions to be traded in exchange. And the problem with the sanctions is that these are sanctions passed by Congress. These are law. Congress put them into law. Only Congress can take them off the books. Thankfully, Congress did write into those laws the power for the president to waive the sanctions temporarily. So the way this works is that the president, he can say, it's in the national interest for me to waive sanctions on Iranian oil exports or Iranian financial transactions for 120 days. And he can keep doing that for 120 days as long as he certifies to Congress that it's in the national interest and it meets certain requirements. So he has the tools right now to be able to ink the deal and implement the deal. He doesn't have the tools to seal the deal. And that's where you come in. You have the tools to make Congress seal the deal. Because after November 24th, if we get that deal, we're only going to have 2 more years of Obama, a president who has basically invested his legacy into getting this agreement, who has put a team around him who, of course we have differences with some of the folks on his team. Maybe we're not aligned in every single area that they work on. But on the Iran issue, this is the best team we've had. These guys are committed to getting this deal. They're committed to diplomacy. They want this agreement. They want it bad. If we don't get the deal sealed under Obama in these next 2 years, if we don't convince Congress to allow for these sanctions to be lifted and pass legislation that authorizes those sanctions to be lifted, the next president can't be relied on to go to Congress and ask for those authorizations. I don't care who it is. It's going to be a much more difficult task to convince another president to invest the capital in order to lift these sanctions. And frankly, I think a lot of the groups who are opposed to this deal are banking on that. The strategy after there's a deal is not necessarily kill the deal, although there will be attempts to kill it. Lindsey Graham just said today he's going to kill the deal. He used those words. Haim Saban, who funds the Saban Center, major Democratic fundraiser, said if it's a bad deal and I were Bibi, I'd bomb those SOBs. Today he said that. So there's going to be that kind of talk. But I think they understand that we are powerful enough to not allow for them to kill the deal. So they're going to try to contain the deal. They're not going to allow for the deal to get sealed, and they think they can wait it out. Wait it out until, this president's gone, or maybe this movement isn't as active. Maybe Iran's no longer front and center. And that's when you start to escalate. That's when you start to pass sanctions to undermine the deal and find little threads to pull in order to unravel the deal. And this will happen on the Iranian side too, as well. If they don't do their own legislative action to ratify portions of the deal, this will get unraveled. So we need to make this deal permanent, and we can do that. Those of us in this room, because we got here because of the grassroots action. Remember back, it was a year ago. It was actually a year ago, probably close to the day. That the interim agreement was struck between Iran and the P5+1. This precedent-setting agreement that was brokered late in Vienna and sort of started this process. And that deal said that Iran was going to take certain confidence-building measures. They were going to, they're enriching at 20%. They were going to reduce that to 5%, so get it further away from weapons capability. They were going to allow daily inspections of all their nuclear facilities, up from just bi-monthly inspections. They're going to take all these measures to allow for these negotiations to proceed with the confidence that they weren't going to game the system and advance their program while the talks were happening. And at the same time, the United States agreed we were going to do the same thing. We weren't going to pass new sanctions on Iran and allow for these talks to drag out while we continue to punish Iran's economy and punish the Iranian people. So the only thing that we had to do was not pass new sanctions. That was the deal. That's what we agreed to. That's what we agreed to with the interim agreement. And so what did Congress do? Congress turned around almost literally the very next week and introduced new sanctions. The exact thing we said we wouldn't do under the deal, that's what they did. And as you all know, the guy who sponsored those sanctions, the guy who wrote the bill, was Senator Menendez. That was a very precarious situation. There was a real danger that Senator Menendez was going to get those sanctions passed, and the deal would be dead, and talks would be off, and we'd be headed back towards the path of war. And very quickly, that bill, it racked up 50 co-sponsors. Now, or 51 co-sponsors, which is technically what you need to pass a bill in the Senate. That's not how it actually works. In the Senate, you need 60 votes just to get a vote on the bill. So the people behind that measure were working hard and trying to convince people, sign on to these sanctions, and our groups were telling them, no, don't do it, don't kill the talks. Well, very quickly, they got up to 59 co-sponsors, right below the level they needed in order to pass these sanctions and kill the deal. And the sponsors of the bill, I don't think it was necessarily Senator Menendez's staff, I think it was probably Mark Kirk's staff, went to CNN and said, not only do we have 60 votes and we're going to get this thing passed, we have 67 votes. I have a piece of paper with the names of 67 senators written on it in order to not just pass this bill, but if the president tries to veto it, we can override his veto. These sanctions are a fait accompli. This is it. We're going to kill the deal. But a funny thing happened. All of you activated, and you called your senators, you delivered petitions. I was going to meetings with Senate offices, and they were telling me, at a 10-to-1 basis, they were getting more calls opposed to the sanctions than in favor of them. People were sending delegations to DC. I think we did a tally of all the groups: NIAC, Coalition for Peace Action, FCNL, Win Without War, J Street, all these groups working on this. And there was something, I think it was something like 650,000 calls were made in that period of time. This is amazing. The sanctions don't get beat. You don't beat sanctions. You don't beat AIPAC. And yet, you guys delivered 650,000 calls. So then the folks who signed on to the bill started wondering, are we doing the right thing here? Was this the right move? And I remember we had a meeting. We brought together some Senate offices, some staff to sort of strategize. These were all staffers who their boss hadn't signed on to the bill, and we were talking about, okay, how do we prevent this thing from hitting 60, and then let alone 67? And I remember I pulled one of the staffers aside from an office who wasn't very necessarily senior, but sort of a pivotal Senate office. And I told him, look, it's great that we have your boss on our side and that he hasn't signed on to this bill. But that's not enough. We can't have your moral support. We need to have you affirmatively supporting this deal and affirmatively saying no to the sanctions bill. If you just sit on the fence, it's only a matter of time before the other side pushes you over. We need you to get out there and support this thing and oppose these sanctions. And he gave me excuses about, well, this or that. My boss is, has this coming up or is on, has to defer to this member, et cetera, et cetera. But he said, okay, we'll think about it. We'll discuss it. And that was on a Friday. That Tuesday, that member, that senator came out, issued a statement and said, I oppose this bill. He came out with that statement. Then two other senators came out with their statement. And then after a while, some of the senators who were actually already on the bill said, you know what, we don't think there should be a vote right now. And just like that, the whole house of cards collapsed, and there was no vote on the sanctions bill, and we beat the bill. And the deal was protected. So these interactions, I'm one person talking to one staffer. That staffer is also aware of how many calls are coming in. He knows how many op-eds are being written and how many meetings are being held with his office. And there were enough of those contacts and touches that his boss decided, you know what, there's a lot of reasons for me to stay silent on this and give my moral support and just sort of be in the background. But they were nudged in the right direction, and they took an affirmative stance in support of diplomacy. And that's how you win this thing. And that's what we need to do once there is a deal. We need to redouble these efforts. And we need to make sure that Cory Booker and Senator Menendez and Senator Casey and Senator Toomey all hear from you that it's not good enough. It's definitely not good enough to be supporting new sanctions. But it's also not good enough to be silent. We need them to be supporting diplomacy, and they need to know that their constituents want them to be on the right side of this thing. So I'll leave it there. I'd love to talk more about how we actually seal this deal and effective ways that activists can interact with their Senate and House offices. But I just want to thank you for helping us get to this position where we are today that was unimaginable just a couple years ago. So thank you.
First question is, do those people who want to kill the deal just want to deny the president and foreign policy victory, or do they want a regime change in Iran? What is the ultimate goal of the sanctions?
So I think it's really difficult to generalize and say, what all of the people that are voting for sanctions believe in. I think that look, right now it's partisan. On the sanctions bill, S 1881, there was a clear partisan split. There were a handful of Democrats who signed on to it, but every Republican except for Rand Paul and Jeff Flake, who really, withstood a lot of pressure, every Republican signed on to the sanctions. And so in one respect, yes, this is largely motivated by the fight between Republicans and Democrats and the desire to deny the president any, legislative or policy victories. I think that there are then some folks in Congress who are indeed more versed in this issue and not necessarily looking at it purely as a Republican-Democrat thing, or this interest group has, is behind this and so I'm going to sign off on it, but who really do view the sanctions as an important policy tool to achieve an agenda that I think is, we've seen it before. We saw it with Iraq. It's an agenda aimed at ensuring that sanctions prevent any sort of diplomatic engagement, and that eventually either Iran is toppled from, people. I think what Mark Kirk has said is it's okay to take the food out of the mouths of ordinary Iranians because you can't eat a nuclear program, and eventually people are going to get so incensed that they're going to turn out into the streets and overthrow the government. I think that anybody who understands Iran knows that that's not going to happen, and that actually sanctions have collapsed the middle class in Iran and really are threatening to to make Iran no longer a middle class society. And really, if you look at the political activism inside of Iran and the civil society groups and things like that, Iran has those traditions because of their middle class. And when you're sanctioning people and you're making it so that people don't have time to organize and demonstrate or to put together these movements, they're focused more on putting food on their table, and making sure their kids are all right. They don't have time to challenge the government. And so it's a really backward strategy. But I think that for a lot of these guys, it's about preventing any sort of shift in which the United States and Iran have relations. And you see that right now with the ISIS thing. Last week, President Obama, it was revealed, wrote a secret letter to the Supreme Leader. And heaven forbid, he said that if there's a nuclear deal, the U.S. and Iran may be able to work together on the ISIS situation. And this sent a lot of people in Washington up in arms because we of course can't collaborate with Iran on any of these things, even though we're on the same side of the ledger as they are. So this to me demonstrates that the sanctions and the policy of non-engagement that we had for so many years and the effort to isolate Iran also is a sanction on ourselves. The United States is not allowed to pursue its own interests when they happen to align with Iran. There's a barrier there. And so I think for the sanctions, it's a way to make sure that never happens. And down the road, either we get a situation like Iraq or a situation like North Korea. But either way, it ends very badly for the Iranian people and for U.S. and world interests. So I'll leave it at that.
If climate and environmental concerns are paramount and the clock ticking is recognized, why are we stalled in the issues of nuclear expansions? Alternative methods of energy should be emphasized and disarmament would naturally follow, wouldn't it? It's interesting. Iran has really significant environmental problems, and there's a real opportunity for the United States and Iran to work together on these issues and for some positive collaboration to actually address these things. As far as this isn't really a question, but I do think it's important that we recognize that while there may be double standards in some situations, what we're talking about right now is the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, states like the United States, who had nuclear weapons when the treaty was put together, are required to be eliminating those weapons. And then states like Iran, who is a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, their requirement is you can have a peaceful nuclear program. You can't have a weapons program. What these negotiations, if we get a deal, it's going to be a deal that hits that sweet spot where the parties are agreeing, okay, on Iran's side, this is what Iran needs to have a peaceful nuclear program. This is what Iran needs to not be denied key technology that it needs in order to pursue its legitimate interests. And on the side of the P5+1, this is what needs to happen in order to verify that there's no nuclear weapons activity going on. And I think these are both legitimate interests. I mean,
there's no denying that the NPT says you can't have a nuclear weapon, but there's also no denying that the NPT says you're entitled to peaceful nuclear energy and domestic, nuclear energy. So we have to find that sweet spot, and if good policy instead of bad politics prevails, we can get an agreement that meets both of those interests and is satisfactory to everybody involved.
What do you think makes Menendez tick?
Well, that's a loaded question. Is there a Menendez staffer in the room who's trying to say something bad? I don't know. I mean, Reverend Moore pointed out Menendez has been good on some things. He voted against the Iraq War. I do, sorry, and that's big, and we shouldn't ignore those things. I think that he's motivated. He has a strong affinity for sanctions. I mean, I can't square. I don't know how to win an argument with somebody about sanctions if they believe that the Cuba sanctions are working. How many decades of sanctions, failing to achieve any objective, do you need in order to say, maybe there's a better way? I think that's a lot of it. I also think, just to sort of dig in, I think that for Menendez, some of this is a little bit of a legacy issue for him as well. I think that the White House has done itself a disservice by giving way too much credit to the sanctions for these negotiations happening. A lot of the things that Iran is bringing to the table right now, it was the same guys. It was Rouhani and Zarif back in the early 2000s who were making the same offers, the same concessions. They offered to suspend. They actually suspended enrichment. That was all happening before sanctions. But the Obama administration has really said, well, sanctions bar Iran to the table. And that has become it's become the gospel in Washington. And so for Menendez, he says, look, if my sanctions that you guys didn't want in the White House, you were opposing the sanctions, if my sanctions are what is responsible for bringing Iran to the table, then I need to be brought in for this deal. I need to be a part of this. I need to get some of the credit. And so I think that's partially what motivates him. And then, other than that, I do think that Menendez really believes what he's doing here. I just think he's wrong. I think that's it. And, with all politicians, there's what they believe, and then there's what they're able to do. And there's the leverage that you as constituents hold. And you can rebalance that cost-benefit analysis that he has in order for him to say, I need to back off of this. I need to let the president get this deal. I think he's backed down before on this issue, and I think he can back down again if we're strong enough.
The pushback for the U.S. is, why should we trust them? What exactly will hold them to the agreement? How will we know?
Yeah, it's simple. You don't need an agreement with a party you don't trust. If we trusted Iran, we'd say, yeah, you can have your nuclear program and we don't need inspectors and do whatever you want. The whole point of getting this deal is that there's no trust on either side. And both sides have very legitimate reasons to not trust each other. There's a long history, and I don't need to repeat it for you, about U.S. behavior in Iran, Iranian behavior towards the U.S. There is no love lost between the governments of these two countries, and there's a lot of legitimate reasons for neither country to trust each other. That's why you talk to each other. That's why you broker these agreements. If there's an agreement, it'll be verifiable. It's going to mean that we have, unfettered, IAEA has unfettered access to nuclear facilities and verifies that the program is purely peaceful. That's not an agreement you strike with somebody you trust. That's an agreement you strike with somebody for whom you need to verify their activities. And the same goes on the U.S. side. Iran is going to need to see real sanctions relief in order for this quid pro quo to take place. And if the sanctions relief isn't forthcoming, if Congress botches this, the U.S. is going to be in violation, and Iran's going to have recourse to exit the deal and start to unravel the sanctions without making those concessions. So the key here, when you have two parties that don't trust each other, is you need to have buy-in on both sides. You need to have a deal that interlocks the parties and make sure that if one violates, the other is able to leave the agreement and not be bound to an agreement that punishes them if the party does not uphold its side of the deal. So yeah, so this, and the sort of the short cheeky answer is this deal is no trust, all verify, or something like that. That's the talking point that everybody says because Ronald Reagan is the king of everything. So, but yeah, this is a deal about verification, not trust.
Who are the members of Kerry's team who are the Iranian negotiators?
So Kerry's team actually, the sort of the principal on his team is William Burns, who actually is he's now left the State Department, but he's staying on as a consultant. But he and Jake Sullivan, who was sort of a Clinton hand at the State Department, they actually began these negotiations, sort of the predecessor negotiations to what we see now, back in 2013 in Oman, and it was in secret. And it had to be in secret because if they had done them in public, they would have gotten attacked by everybody who's attacking the talks right now. So they had these secret talks with Iran in Oman to begin to set the stage for these actual full-blown, P5+1 negotiations. And it's sort of ironic, or it's sort of a nice full circle that now today, a year and a half, 2 years later, they're back in Oman to hopefully be putting the final touches on this diplomatic agreement. So yeah, and then on the Iranian side, as I sort of pointed out, you've got Javad Zarif, who is the foreign minister, and he's somebody. I don't know if you've all heard this, but the Rouhani cabinet has more U.S. educated PhDs than any other government in the world, and Zarif is one of them. He's somebody who spent a lot of time in the United States. I think if you look at his track record in the diplomatic corps, he was under the president before Ahmadinejad under Khatami. Zarif and Rouhani were on the negotiating team, and they were sort of behind the effort to try to broker an agreement on the nuclear issue. Zarif actually, a lot of people say he's the one who wrote the grand bargain back in 2003. There was an effort by the Iranians to send through back channels an offer to the United States for a grand bargain to resolve all of the issues, the nuclear issues, the terrorism issues, the sanctions issues. And it's a sweeping document that could have diffused a lot of the tensions that we saw then over the next decade. Zarif actually, supposedly, he's the one who wrote that. He was definitely one of the main forces behind it. And so he's somebody who I think has really dedicated a lot of his career to try to build these relations and try to steer these ships in a more positive direction. And he's been burned before. Him and Rouhani have been burned before. They, like I said, in the early 2000s, they had these negotiations. They sent that grand bargain. It got rejected by the Bush administration, who said, we don't negotiate with evil. This was after we had gone into Iraq and we were beating our chests. We thought we're going to take over the whole Middle East. They said, we don't negotiate with evil. Then talks started between Iran and the Europeans, and actually Iran suspended enrichment, but they couldn't come to a deal, and Rouhani and Zarif were really punished inside of Iran for having suspended enrichment and gotten nothing for it. And this, in a lot of respects, is what helped usher in Ahmadinejad and sort of the resistance movement, the movement of the only way to deal with the West is through resistance. Rouhani and Zarif wanted to do engagement, and they got burned by it. So this is sort of a second chance for them. And I always try to make sure congressional staff understands that this is not a new thing, and these guys are really serious about this effort to try to bridge this gap with the United States.
Are there conditions now relative to Iran similar to conditions in the 1970s with respect to China that would enable a call for normalization of U.S.-Iranian relationship?
Normalization.
Yeah. Like Nixon to China is the refrain that some folks use as far as the need to repair relations with Iran, because there's so many overlapping interests in the region. There's, of course, a lot of differences, but there are a lot of interests. Without getting too deep into this and potentially out of my depth on how the rapprochement with China actually works, I do think it's really interesting. You've got the United States in a lot of respects sort of on the ropes in the region, some very bad wars and the threat of being dragged back in, and you've got a real, possibility that building relations with Iran can help to prevent Iraq from collapsing, the United States being dragged into this, and can prevent, can allow for other issues like Afghanistan and potentially a political settlement in Syria. There are all these areas where if there's some level of interaction with Iran, a lot of these problems that are sort of looming and could be really disastrous for the United States can potentially be diffused through, a political agreement instead of a military fiasco. But I say that because, when Nixon went to China, this was sort of a similar situation where we were, recovering from Vietnam, or sort of in the grips of all of the fallout from that, and sort of a foreign policy in a lot of respects on the ropes. And it made a lot of sense to actually not continue to have this ideological barrier separating two countries from actually pursuing their geopolitical interests. So I think there are a lot of similarities. The real question, though, is this deal going to be a one-off sort of tactical thing that puts out the nuclear fire and sort of takes the nuclear problem off the table? Or is this going to represent the beginning of this actual shift where we're beginning to dialogue with Iran, where Iran begins to repair some of its relations in the region, and you start to see a dialogue with the Persian Gulf states? And maybe you have another process regarding Syria where Iran is brought in to be able to negotiate some sort of resolution to address the issues there. It's a question, so is this going to be a major shift, or is this a tactical one-off that puts out one fire but doesn't change some of these fundamental issues? I think that's what's going to decide whether this is truly a Nixon to China moment or something much more limited.
Punishing civilians is prohibited in international law. What allows states to impose sanctions? UN sanctions on Iraq caused death of hundreds of thousands of children. The basis for the sanctions is the UN resolutions. I think that I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a scholar of international law or anything like that. I'll say this though: the sanctions are a clear, it's a human rights problem, and the sanctions are not supposed to be targeting ordinary people, innocent civilians. These are sanctions that supposedly are targeting the economy such that Iran cannot pursue activities that the UN Security Council have said they have to stop pursuing. And the fact of the matter is, those sanctions have for a long time not been nothing even close to resembling that. They have been broad sanctions. They've made anybody who's in the Iranian economy subject to those sanctions. They've punished ordinary people. The UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights, he writes a lot about the human rights abuses that the Iranian government commits against people inside of Iran. He also talks about the human rights abuses of the sanctions. They deprive Iran of getting medicine. They have deprived, even food and other licensed goods from being able to reach Iran. They've had effects far beyond what the people who put them together claimed they were going to have. And just to wrap it up, as far as international law goes, in the EU, a lot of the sanctions have actually been unraveled because the European Union has not been able to demonstrate how they pertain to the nuclear program. So a lot of Iran's major banks have been sanctioned, and this has gone to the courts, and the courts have found that actually you can't demonstrate why targeting an entire country's banking infrastructure is legitimate in trying to prevent them from building nuclear weapons or doing other prescribed activities. So there actually is a move to try to unwind those sanctions. But on the US side, I don't see anything like that happening anytime soon. The only way really that I think that the US is going to run into legal issues is if there's a deal that the US violates by passing new sanctions. There could be action at the WTO or elsewhere to have counter sanctions on the United States for violating this agreement and passing new sanctions. So things could get very messy in that regard.
But bottom line is that, the sanctions have been a humanitarian disaster. And I think that's another great thing about this deal is on top of preventing war and preventing nuclear weapons, we're actually going to lift sanctions that are hurting ordinary, innocent people who, have largely positive feelings about the United States. And if we're not careful, we're going to lose that potential friendship we have with the Iranian people by punishing them with these sanctions. So hopefully we can get them lifted.
How can Iran's main concern, i.e. total and immediate removal of sanctions, practically and realistically be addressed, given the limited powers that the President of the U.S. has and very tough sell of it in Congress?
Yeah, so how can Iran's concern of total and immediate removal of sanctions? I don't think that, I don't know if that is actually going to survive in the deal. I think it's probably going to be a phased elimination of the sanctions. I think that the United States and Iran want to front load this agreement because they understand that they only have a short window to actually make this deal stick. And so the more concessions that both sides can deliver up front, sort of the greater momentum this deal will have, so that in a couple of years, if there is a political shift in either country that makes it, makes it so that the deal could potentially be unraveled, there will be so much, economic interaction and so much has been accomplished that it's going to be really hard to bring things back to where they were. But what you're asking really is, how is Obama going to be able to get Congress to lift these sanctions, right? I mean, that's the million-dollar question. I don't want to, there's a tension because Obama doesn't want Congress to act right now. Congress, likely if there's a deal, there's going to be a push for Congress to be able to vote, have a resolution of disapproval on the deal, which would probably not have any legal effect, but then it would cue up further action to prevent the implementation of the deal. There also, either in conjunction with that or in a phased way, there will likely be legislation to impose sanctions. But I think that legislation will be defeated. I think it will be a pretty naked attempt to dismantle this agreement, and I don't think there will be enough support for them to do that. I think we can beat back that attempt. What I think needs to happen, though, is this tension between not wanting Congress to do anything and the need for Congress to actually act affirmatively is going to lead the parties to have a compromise in which the White House says to Congress, fine, we're going to give you some oversight over this deal. We're going to set up either a commission or we're going to allow you to pass a measure that says if Iran violates the deal, such and such sanctions will go into place. Some way that Congress can say, okay, we have a role in this. And in exchange, Congress authorizes the president to have the authority to lift the sanctions at the time that is outlined in the deal. Compromise is in short supply right now. Maybe we don't get there, and if we don't get there, I think we're in a bad situation, but my hope is that there'll be so much momentum behind this deal that a lot of the people that are pushing for it to get unraveled are sort of going to be silenced. There's going to be enough pressure, not just from grassroots, but also from business interests and European countries and companies and things like that, that the attempts to unravel the deal will basically be nullified. But it's really important, if we really want to see this thing sealed, we've got to find that compromise. And the compromise I outlined is one we've presented to the White House and to Congress. We haven't gotten any traction yet, but we're going to be pushing for it in the next couple of years.
Thank you.